Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending where you are. I'm Jonathan. I'm here with Raymond Lacqua, who will be our
Morning.
presenter today. It's almost 10 o'clock, so we just want to give everybody a few minutes to log in, set up the systems, and if you need to grab a cup of coffee or a glass of water, go ahead and we'll start in just 2 minutes. So please go ahead, make yourselves comfortable, and we'll get started very shortly. Okay, great. So let's get started. Today we're here to discuss section 4.5 and a couple other sections, to be honest, about ISO 19600. So primarily focusing today on the identification of obligations and the evaluation of compliance risk. I think this is really an important topic. It definitely will help your organization get ahead of problems before they occur and come into compliance with ISO. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. If you have questions during the webinar, please put your questions into the questions panel on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar system. We'll be addressing questions at the end of the presentation. And we've booked an hour and a half, but certainly we can stay as long as there are questions. There are handouts in the right-hand side. You can download the slides for today, as well as a couple other slides that we've loaded in there. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar. You should receive that tomorrow by email. So if you're participating in the webinar, you will get a recording tomorrow. There's also a chat where you can certainly pop in any questions or comments into the chat on the right-hand side. We'll have a series of polls throughout the webinar. I think it's a total of 5 of them, and they're really there to just help us understand the audience, help us understand where you're coming from, some of the challenges, and hopefully help you guide you towards improved compliance obligations management. So I'm going to do a very short introduction about Mnemonic, what we do, our compliance philosophy, and then I'll be handing it over to Ray for the remainder of the presentation in just a few minutes. So while people are still getting settled in, why don't we start with our first poll, which is how many mnemonic webinars have you attended? And so this is just to get a sense of the audience and how many of you have been to one of our previous webinars, whether it was on ISO 19600 or on a few others. Just good to know where we're starting from. And this webinar today, I would say, is a fairly deep dive on this specific section of ISO 19600. So hopefully it will be helpful to as many people as possible. All right, I see we've got most of the votes in. So I'm going to close this poll and just want to keep this train moving. I will share the results. So it looks like for over about half of people, this is their first webinar with us. So welcome. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to participate in this webinar. And then for about, looks like the rest, you've done either 1, 2, or 3 webinars. So hopefully this builds on some of the things you've seen previously with us. Okay, great. So I'm just going to do a short introduction on Mnemonic. Very briefly, this is not a sales pitch at all, but Mnemonic offers a web and mobile compliance solution. We help businesses stay in compliance with their obligations. We collaborate with experts around the world to implement this solution, and Ray Raymond Lacqua from Lean Compliance is one such expert. He's been working in the field of compliance for a long time, and he can certainly work with you to build out your program, improve your program, and implement various solutions. And the last thing that Mnemonic really does is that we provide access and updates to laws, regulations, guidance documents for about 45 countries. So not only do we help you manage your compliance obligations, we actually provide you a lot of the raw material coming from government agencies. So very quickly, the agenda for today is an intro about Mnemonic, which should take less than 5 minutes, then the webinar on ISO 19000 section 4.5, and then Q&A. So very briefly, what Mnemonic wants to do with all of its customers and with everybody is to help you move from the left-hand side of this compliance maturity to the right-hand side. A lot of businesses, organizations start as being highly reactive, just putting out fires as they appear. And our goal is to help you move all the way over to the right-hand side here, be forward thinking. Everybody knows what they need to do, why they need to do it, when they need to do it, and how they need to do it. And if you achieve that, you will definitely find cost savings, operational improvements, and a lot of other benefits. And what we've seen over the last 12 years working with companies all around the world in every industry is that most organizations do not know all of their compliance obligations. They just don't know everything they need to be in compliance with, which inevitably leads to surprises, as we like to call them. Call them problems, call them surprises, because a typical manufacturing facility has about 3,000 compliance obligations. So this is environment, health, safety, quality, coming from government, coming from corporate, coming from industry bodies. And so that's a lot of compliance obligations to manage. And not only that, there's at least 200 new ones per year because your operations change and the government's changing things and the industry is always evolving. So this is a big task to manage, and hopefully some of the tools today will help you manage it more effectively. And this slide I put together yesterday with the point that if you solve compliance challenges early, right at the planning phase of a project or starting up a facility, you end up saving a lot of money. I think anybody who's studied a little bit of lean manufacturing, Six Sigma, things of that nature knows that you want to solve quality, you want to solve problems right at the beginning. And the further along you go towards your production and towards deadlines, the more painful it is to fix any sort of compliance issues. And the story that I heard from an automobile manufacturer down in Brazil was that they had built a new van for the Brazilian market, and they ramped up production. They had already produced thousands of these vans, only to discover that during the testing and implementation phase, the Brazilian government had changed the regulations around seatbelts, and they had to go and retrofit and all these vans and change their production. And this cost them, of course, millions of dollars. So having a robust compliance obligations management system and program is a huge cost saving. But of course, you only realize that when you hit one of these surprises, because we really do believe that modern organizations can operate efficiently, satisfy all of your customers without any sort of violations, spills, product recalls, or worker injuries. I think the old school mentality was, well, the occasional non-compliance is just part of doing business. It's a cost of doing business. But I think in the modern 2020 world, international business, lots of competition, you have to get ahead of the curve. And that means disciplined approach to compliance obligations management. And just as one example, there's been hundreds of regulations posted about COVID globally, and just thousands and thousands of notices and guidelines published. I was speaking to one customer who's in the banking sector and who was overwhelmed with the amount of COVID challenges that they were trying to deal with. Just within one city, you can have regulations coming at you from different boroughs, such as the city of New York. So it's a very, very big challenge, and COVID in many ways only makes it more challenging. So we want to help you eliminate these problems, surprises with comprehensive compliance. And what that does, and Ray is going to dive into the details, is it means carefully evaluating all the sources of information, regulatory standards, contracts, etc., across your various issues. So environment, safety, HR, whatever issues you're trying to tackle. And then you want to have actions and audits to make sure you're always in compliance. So it's time for our second poll. Before we hand it over to Ray, let me launch this poll. And the question is, how familiar are you with ISO 19600? It's actually technically not a standard, it's a guideline because there's no hard requirements in it. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention, to be honest. We did a webinar on this earlier this year. It's a standard that kind of went under the radar because it was published at the same time as some anti-bribery standards. Again, it's not a standard, it's a guideline, but I think it's very, very helpful. And that's why we'll be talking about it today. So I just want to see how many folks are already a bit familiar with ISO 19600. And we've got 67% have voted, so I'm just going to let a couple more seconds go here. All right, so I'm going to close this poll and share the results. So over half of the attendees today have no knowledge of ISO 19600, and then 40% have a little bit of understanding. So we'll be talking about one specific element of ISO 19600 today, but I think if you're interested in this topic, you can go to our webinars page and take a look at the webinar we did on the overall guideline last spring, and hopefully that will help you understand what this is about. Okay, great. So I'm going to hide the poll. And yeah, at the end of the day, we'll be talking about obligations, actions, and some auditing today, which is the three core pillars of what Mnemonic builds for its customers. And at the end of the day, what Ray will be showing you today and what Mnemonic tries to achieve is helping you map out all your obligations, map them to your internal operations, always be ready for an audit, and instead focus on performance improvements, and ultimately increase trust with your staff, with your partners, within your organization, with your communities, and then fewer incidents and reduced risk. Okay, sorry, there was one more poll before we get into this. So the question was, do you already have a comprehensive list of your compliance obligations? So just a last poll, I promise, before Ray takes over. Do you have a comprehensive list of your compliance obligations? And I'll be interested to see this. And maybe we should ask this poll as well after the webinar to see if what Ray presents changes your perception of your preparedness. But we'll give this just a couple more seconds for people to chime in. And do you have a complete list of your compliance obligations, or do you feel it is a complete list, which maybe would be a better phrasing of this? All right, I'm going to close the poll in 30 seconds. We got more than half the people voted. All right, let's close this and I'll share. So we have about 40% are saying yes, they have a comprehensive list, 33% say no, and then 30% are unsure. Meaning maybe they don't know where the list is or if it's complete or not. So there's some work to be done here. Okay, great. So let me just introduce my friend and colleague, Raymond Lacqua. So he is the founder and chief compliance engineer at Lean Compliance Consulting. He's really focused on helping businesses that are ambitious and ethical and that operate in highly regulated, high-risk industries improve the effectiveness of their compliance programs. He's been in this space for many years and has much more experience than I do, which is why I asked him to do this webinar with me today. And he's a professional engineer in electrical and computer engineering. I'm an engineer as well. Maybe that's why we get along so well. And he's consulted for over 25 years across North America. Lots and lots of industry experience with oil and gas, pharma, medical devices, and he has a great blog. I definitely encourage you to go take a look at his blog at leancompliance.ca. There's a lot of valuable information there, and I know he's working hard on a book that will bring together his thoughts on this space. So without further ado, let me introduce Ray, and I will make you the presenter, Ray. Just give me 1 second.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
So let me make you presenter. Okay, there we go. You should be the presenter now, Ray, and you should be able to share your screen. And I'm going to drop my webcam and listen attentively.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, I'm just going to just shut off my webcam here. That'll help improve the bandwidth for those that are connecting perhaps on lower speed internet. So let's get going here. Okay, well, thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, everyone. It's a privilege for me to be here and to be talking about what I think is perhaps one of the most important aspects when it comes to effectively managing compliance. And what is that? Well, that's knowing your obligations, not at a surface level. No, not in an abstract or a checklist or any of the common things that we find inside of a legal or obligations register. No, we're going to take a deeper look at what we need to know to identify, manage, and evaluate risk associated with meeting all your obligations. So we're going to get to know our obligations more closely and in a more intimate way. And I hope you're ready for this. Now, why are we doing this? Why is this important? Well, it's because you cannot meet all your obligations unless you know what they are, where they apply to your business, what is expected to meet them, and how you're going to make certain that you do with a high degree of confidence that you'll meet them today, but not just today, but every day in the future. That's why this is important. So let's dive in. Now, some of you may heard the phrase, know your customer, know your client, or know your product. If you've been in the financial sector, if that's your area of compliance, and you certainly have heard these phrases and strategies used in recent years. And they have to do with regulatory requirements recently introduced in the financial sector. And the purpose for introducing these, what we call KYC requirements, is to help ensure that proposed customers, agents, consultants, and distributors are anti-bribery compliant, and they are actually who they claim to be. And the idea is fairly straightforward. It's this: the better you know your customer, the better you can evaluate the risk. The better you know your customer, the better you can evaluate the risk. Now, initially, the strategy and these requirements were imposed only on the financial sector. But now we're observing in an increasing measure that non-financial industries are adopting similar practices as a risk-based approach to protecting other things that really matter. And so today, we're going to take a look at these practices as they relate to meeting all your obligations, and not only those, but including those associated with financial risk. But first, I need to introduce you to my friend Carl, who's asked us to help him out today. Now, Carl and the company he works for are fictitious, but the challenges he and his company faces are not. They're very real and very common to many of those that work in highly regulated, high-risk industries. Now, Carl works for a pipeline company in Western Canada. Now, you may remember him from one of my previous webinars when he worked as a process safety manager. At that time, we looked at helping him incorporate lean principles to improve process safety. But today, he's looking for help of a different kind. He has recently transferred into the role of environmental manager. Congratulations, Carl. He wants to better understand the risk his company has taken on with respect to environmental obligations. Now, he's looked and he's found an environmental legal register, which was created when they adopted ISO 14000 back in 2015. But he's noticed that, unfortunately, it's not been well maintained. The information is sparse and most of the register is not actionable. And Carl also suspects that he might be missing some obligations. And perhaps this describes your situation and the status of your legal register as well. Maybe you're in the same situation as Carl. Now, Carl, and perhaps yourself, would be and should be rightfully concerned, as we all should be. Uncertainty is not just limited to the financial sector alone. No, it applies to all aspects of business and in life. And in Carl's case, in meeting environmental obligations. Now, as Jonathan has already mentioned, but it's worth stating again, is that most companies, including Carl's, find that they are unsure of what their obligations are. And for the most part, only managing a portion of them, not just in numbers, but also in terms of the components of an obligation. We're going to introduce that and dive into that a little later on in today's presentation. Now, Carl, being an effective manager, realizes that he needs some help. So he's asked us if we might help him today surface, using the iceberg metaphor here, surface more of his obligations and help him understand what these look like and what he might need to do to improve them. Now, he's given us some specific questions, and I'm going to show them to you here. Now, you might not be working in a pipeline company. Maybe some of you are, but you will have the same kind of questions. You may have the same kind of questions as Carl does. So let's take a look at these more carefully. Number one, his question to us is, how should we identify our environmental obligations? Well, that's a good question. That's a good place to start. Where do we look? How do we talk about them? How do we collect data about them? Which leads us into his second question. What information about these obligations will help us effectively contend with compliance risk? And that's, of course, one of the purposes of compliance, is to manage and reduce risk. So that's a good question and something that he wants to know. And question three, how do we improve the use of our legal register, the one that hasn't been well maintained, to better manage his obligations? Okay, so essentially Carl is asking the question, well, what do I need to know? And maybe you're also asking these same questions. What do you need to know to more comprehensively manage all your obligations? Let's see if we can help Carl. And perhaps along the way, we might help some of you by answering these questions. So let's see what we can do. To start with, we're going to use ISO 19600 as our guide. It's a compliance management standard that's applicable to all the obligations that a company needs or chooses to comply with. Today, we're going to zero in on the Know Your Obligation, or KYO, requirements. And specifically, we're going to look in some detail sections 4.5 and 4.6, which we will look at shortly. Now, it's my hope that this approach should help answer Carl's questions. And later in the presentation, we're going to have a poll and you can let me know if we did or not. And maybe in the process, as we answer these questions, we'll better understand what should go into an obligations register to improve the probability that each obligation will be met, and thus improving overall compliance. Okay, let's go. Okay, so ISO 19600, it provides important definitions with respect to both obligations and risk. You know, one of the many challenges, and many of you will certainly resonate with this, for those that want to approach compliance more comprehensively, is that there are many definitions for the same or similar aspects of compliance. And this creates even more confusion and unnecessary uncertainty. And this hinders the advancement of effective compliance for sure. So 19,600 helps by providing a common vocabulary to talk about compliance. And for that reason alone, affords a great deal of value to helping organizations get their arms around the entire set of obligations in a consistent, efficient, and more comprehensive manner. You might say, it helps to move beyond the silos to a more integrated approach with fewer gaps and vulnerabilities. And maybe that's what you're trying to do as well. And I hope that you are, and that you are working towards that end. Now, an obligation, we need to define it. And ISO 19600 defines it in this way. It's a requirement or a commitment. It's something a company must do and something a company chooses to do. And well, this helps already to determine the scope of what obligations we need to consider. And we'll keep this in mind during the identification of Carl's environmental obligations, which we're going to do shortly. But we know something at this point. We know that we need to cover both mandatory and voluntary obligations. Now, ISO 19600 has several sections to it. We're looking at sections 4.5 and 4.6 today, which we're going to call the Know Your Obligation requirements. And these come early on in the compliance management process. As you can expect, these drive the rest of the compliance activities. You see, the nature of the obligations that we want to manage will need to be taken into account and should be taken into account in how we manage them and what information we need to do so effectively. So it's important that we start here, and that's why it's the first step in the process. Now, here are some subheadings from the sections that we're going to look like, and I've ordered them slightly differently just to align a little closer with the financial KYC requirements. So what do we have? We have section 4.5.1, the identification of compliance obligations. This is very similar to the customer identification program requirements from KYC. We then have section 4.6. This is the identification, analysis, and evaluation of compliance risk. And this very much aligns with the due diligence parts of KYC. This is the due diligence that we need to do on the obligations that we want to manage, or that we need to manage. And lastly, we have 4.5.2, which has to do with the maintenance of compliance obligations. And that's very much aligned with monitoring activities. So instead of the better you know your customer, the better you can evaluate the risk. In the case of obligations, the better you know your obligation, the better you can evaluate the risk. You see, following the steps that flow from these KYO requirements are an important measure. It's an important strategy in contending with not only financial risk, but more generally, compliance risk. So let's take a closer look at these and apply them to Carl's environmental obligations and the questions he's given us to answer. Okay, so here's what the text says regarding section 5.1. And I've highlighted the parts that I would like us to focus on today, and the ones that specifically call out pieces of information, something that we need to know. Well, what do we need to know? Well, we need to know what the process is to identify our obligations. Well, that's important. We need to know the implications those obligations have on our business, on the activities, the products and services, for sure. Well, we need to know how to take these obligations into account. How should they be incorporated in our business? What are we going to do about this? How much rigor or investment are we going to invest in these obligations? We need to know that. Well, we also need to know how we're going to document this. And an obligations register is one of the places that people use. It's an important tool to cataloging and putting this information into it. And we're going to look at that in certainly in some detail. And while we need to know what the sources of the compliance obligations are and making sure that they consider both mandatory, the legal kind of requirements, and in addition to that, the voluntary commitments as well. So those are the things that we need to know. We need to know. So I'm going to just dive into the last one a little bit more carefully here. We need to know what the sources of obligations are and where do they come from? Like, where are the requirements and where are the commitments? And some of you may already seen this in some of my other presentations that I've done. This is a real helpful picture of the obligation landscape. I'm going very quickly here, but I just want to highlight a few parts of this. The right-hand side is the part that we tend to focus on mostly in organizations. It's the corporate requirements. This has to do with accepting public responsibilities. These tend to be more legal obligations or regulatory, code of conduct, dealing with permits, regulatory license obligations. And that makes sense. We need to do this. And we're going to take a different approach to this. We're going to manage these more through an audit process. They tend to be fairly prescriptive. The focus is on conformance to the prescriptive elements that we need to comply with, of course. But on the other side, a side that is not, doesn't usually have the same attention, are the organizational obligations. And this has more to do with accepting stakeholder responsibilities. So these tend to be more industry-based. They tend to be industry standards, tend to be more focused on performance. They tend to be voluntary or discretionary. They tend to be risk-based. Our approach on this deals with more learning and improving as opposed to, complying and then dealing with corrective actions. And it tends to be more proactive because we're talking about anticipating uncertainty and the effects of uncertainty, which is what risk is about. So those are the two things. You notice that they overlap. Many of the sources that we're looking at have components of both now. And that's quite interesting and quite important to understand. So what have we learned so far? That's going to help Carl out, maybe yourself as well. What have we learned to help us understand what information we need to know? So we need to know the process that we have to identify obligations, make sure that we haven't missed any. We need to know what the sources of those obligations are. We need to know where to look. We need to make sure they include both requirements as well as commitments. We also need to know what the implications of those obligations are on our business and how we're going to take that into account. And we need to know how we're going to document all this. So as a question for you, are these identified for your organization? Do you have a process? Do you know what sources to look at? Are you considering both requirements and commitments and so on? Something to think about. So I said that we were going to apply this to Carl's situation, and we're going to do that. So we're going to start to build Carl's obligations register with the information that we just talked about. And so we're going to start doing a preliminary obligation scan. You might call it a legal or regulatory scan, but we want to make sure we cover both sides. So we're going to do an obligation scan. And the first thing that we discover is we're going to look at the government sources. So here's a number of them that you can see here. And again, these may not apply to your particular line of business, but you're going to find similar ones. We have at the top the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change. That has obviously environmental obligations in them. We have the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. We have that both at the federal level and, of course, the provincial level. We have two sets of regulations dealing with methane, the release of methane, and there's many others that are connected to this. And we have specific regulations dealing with onshore pipeline regulations. So we have a number of these. We don't know much about these yet. We're going to talk about them shortly, but we have some that we need to pay attention to. Next, we're going to look at the industry-specific standards and obligations. It's another good place to look. Here we have three of them that I'm going to highlight. We've got the Canadian Standards Association, CSA, Z662. And it's a pipeline system standard, and it contains both safety and environmental obligations, among other things. Now, this one's really interesting. It's a standard, yes, which makes it, in some sense, voluntary. You can adopt it or not. But in Canada, most of the provinces have enacted legislation making the core parts of the standard mandatory and has legal obligations. So when you read the standard, you're going to see mandatory components using, shall statements, you shall do this, as well as the voluntary obligations, which are contained in the annexes at the back. It's quite an interesting way of doing it. The latter is perhaps of greater value and utility for organizations in that it contains best practices. So that's of help to organizations, and they may adopt some of them or part of them. And that's up for organizations to figure out. Now, Carl's company has also joined the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, CEPA, Integrity First program. So it's an industry program. It's voluntary, but it comes with a set of performance-related obligations, as most industry associations do. They're all driving towards zero fatalities, zero incidents, zero emissions, zero violations, and so on, zero data breaches. So whatever association your industry you're part of, you're going to find a similar kind of program. And they're using that. They've adopted that. And finally, they have certain parts of their operation that operate in the United States. So they're looking at API RP 1173, which is a recommended practice by API for pipeline safety. It includes environmental components as well. And it's voluntary, but strongly encouraged by both API and PHMSA. So they're looking at that as well. Okay, now we're going to consider the international standards. So we're kind of working through the different categories or different kinds of obligations. In this case, we've got two ISO standards or guidelines that the company's adopted. The 14,000 which is the environmental management standard, and 19,600, the one that we're using today, which are both applicable to the environmental obligations that Carl has to manage. Now, both of these and most of ISO are voluntary, right? There's no legal aspects to it, and they're management based. Okay, so it's a different kind of approach. It's management-based standards. And we're going to talk more about that later because it's important to understanding what we need to know on how to manage these. And finally, and lastly, we have an internal obligation. These come from policies, contracts, agreements, stakeholder commitments, and so on. Here we've got the corporate EHS policy, and I'm sure you probably have one too. And it may be one for the environment, one for safety, health and safety, and so on. You may have different ones or maybe combined together. And these are going to contain important commitments that the organization is making with regards to the way it wants to govern and manage obligations related to not only environmental concerns, but safety, quality, and other things as well. So this is an important document, but there are others within your organization that will need to be considered. Okay, let me pull all these together. And this is not a comprehensive stack, but it'll be instructive for us today because it covers many of the different areas that we need to focus on. One thing that we can do is appreciate that each one of these are going to have a different terminology, approach, and set of expectations with regards to compliance. That would be a reasonable assumption, and it turns out to be true. And so all of them will need to be managed in a way that complies with the particular approach that is specified within the particular document that we're looking at. So we need to understand these a little bit more carefully. So what we're going to do now is unpack kind of the categories of sources, because it's going to be helpful to understanding how we're going to manage that. So let's go here. So we've got different groupings, you could say, of where these obligations come from, or different kinds of obligation sources. We have frameworks, we have legislative acts, we have regulations that flow from those, we have orders, we have industry programs, we have industry standards, we have guidelines, we have policies. And some of these will have a component of both, like the example of CSA Z662. It's both a standard and a regulation. That's interesting. Each of these categories communicates important information. So it's worth knowing where they come from and what category they're in. They communicate important information regarding the nature of the obligations. So here's a list of it, and I'm not sure if you can see this, the contrast isn't perfect here, but it's a list of different internal and external categories. And you're going to come up with a different list than this one. Some of them will be the same, some may be different. But the question I have is, what does this category tell us about how obligations should be managed? Well, it gives us a clue on which ones are voluntary and which ones are mandatory. That's good to know. It tells us which ones are what regulation or regulatory body is being used here. Like, is it government regulation? Is it industry regulation, or is it self-regulation? Are you managing your own goals, setting your own goals, your own objectives, your own performance criteria? And it could be a combination of both. It gives you a clue. The category tells you a little bit more about whether it's going to be prescriptive or descriptive in terms of how they're specifying the obligations. Could also tell you the frequency that they will change. Many of these will have a particular rotation schedule. Some of them standards are looked at every 4 years. So you can expect every 4 years, you're going to expect a change. So all of this is extremely helpful to managing and to knowing what due diligence we need to put in place to address these obligations. But that's not the only thing that we can understand or that we need to know. The other thing is each one of them will come with a different set of areas that they want to focus on. We can call those topics for today. And the topic could be they could be referencing or concern that they're trying to address is environmental concerns, climate concerns, safety, or combination of all of these and others. So it's important to know which ones these cover. There's obligations are often missed by assuming that an obligation source only pertains to one topic or only contains one kind of obligation type. So knowing and capturing this information about which topic is helpful, and it's helpful in the following way. So what topic helps us understand is whether there's a potential for overlapping obligations. And there will be some, right? Across the stack, you've got multiple areas looking at addressing in management of environmental obligations. And you can tell by the topic that these things are probably going to be connected in some way. And then you can understand if there's any dependencies. Does one depend on another, for instance? Is it built on something else? And that would be worthwhile knowing. Trying to address all of these individually in all its various parts creates a lot of effort and a lot of work. So this is a place that you can look at that'll help you to say, hey, you know, maybe there's some duplication, some overlap that we can then eliminate some of the waste associated with duplication. That would be good. It will also tell you who might be responsible in your organization. You know, the safety manager dealing with safety concerns, the environmental manager dealing with environmental concerns. And it's going to tell you perhaps to some degree, not fully yet, but how they need to be managed, what controls need to be used. Safety controls are going to look different than environmental controls. Some will be the same, but there'll be differences. And so it gives you a clue on what to expect. And that's important. Well, let's continue. There's something else that we can know about our obligation and our source. And that's this, is that all of them are written using a particular approach, a particular regulatory design or compliance design, if you prefer. And I'm going to unpack what this means. So you can see here, we've got some that are performance-based, some that are prescriptive-based, some that are management-based, and some that are even outcome-based. So what does this mean, and how does this help us? And I'm going to look at this, we're going to dive into this shortly, but at this point, I'm going to say that understanding what regulatory or compliance design is used will help you formulate what your objectives for your obligations are. And that's extremely important to knowing whether you are meeting your obligations because you're meeting the objectives, and the objectives are aligned with the expectations of the particular obligation source. So let me just explain this a little bit more. So there are 4 fundamental types of compliance designs, and they're derived by considering regulation in terms of, on the top, micro and macro, so the small things and the big things, alongside of the means and the ends. See on the left-hand side, the means, how we're going to do something, and the ends, what's going to happen, what are the outcomes of doing that. And we can see here that in the first block, we've got prescriptive based designs. This is the micro means. This is the dealing with the small and the how, the details. And this is where we find all the rule-based stuff, and all the prescriptive obligations tend to be in this particular category. Legal regulations tend to be of this kind. Regulatory legislation tends to be of this kind, although they are changing to becoming more performance-based. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, if we move across to the right, we've got management-based standards like ISO 9000 for quality, 14,000 for environment. These broaden things out. So we're focused more on the bigger things now, but still on the how. You know, bigger, you know, not necessarily rules-based in terms of the prescription, but we're going to talk about processes. We're going to prescribe processes by which we achieve the things that we're interested in. Okay, so if you look at every one of the ISO standards, they're all talking about processes and making and requiring certain processes exist. Okay, and that's what they do. And that's what they're about. If we then go into the bottom left-hand corner, we've got micro ends. So here we're talking about the smaller things, but we're now looking at the outcomes. So in this case, these are things that are based on objectives and performance and output. And this is where a lot of industry or market-based regulation and standards come from. This is the space that they're working in. And then lastly, we've got the fourth quadrant. This is the outcome base. This is the macro ends. Big picture, big ends that we're looking at. And duty and liability is one of the big areas here. And every company has a duty and a responsibility for safety and for the environment and things of that nature. And they come from these kinds of obligations. So as you can imagine, depending on the framework you're looking or the approach you're looking at, you're going to need to do something different. You're going to need to know something perhaps different about your obligation in order to understand how to manage them effectively. Okay. And one of the things that you're going to notice, that we notice, is that your objectives will be different, what you're trying to accomplish. In some cases, you're looking at things that are what we call non-persistent events. These are things which you need to, they happen one time. You need to create a procedure. You need to do an assessment. And it's a one-time thing. You do that at the beginning of, embarking on a particular regulation or adopting a new piece of a standard. So those are one-time things. But there are other objectives, some that are what we call persistent maintenance objectives. These have to do with achieving a certain level of performance and then sustaining it, continuing to be able to maintain that over time. And this may be in a particular environmental, emission target that you have to meet and sustain and continue to be able to do that. And if you can't maintain it, you have to have corrective actions in place to be able to sustain that level. And then we have the persistent achievement objectives. And many of the industry standards have these, where you're not only do you kind of move towards a particular target, but you're trying to advance that target over time. So we're trying to get to zero emissions. So these are usually heading downwards rather than upwards in this particular chart. Zero emissions, zero incidents, zero fatalities, and so on. Zero data breaches. And the particular obligation is to make progress. So that one's different than if you're just trying to maintain a certain level. So this tells us a lot of useful information. Now I've put all this together in a diagram to help you visualize where these things come into play. And this is going to help us understand the kind of information that we'll need to put into our obligation register. So let me just orient you around this picture quickly here. Every obligation or commitment, requirement or commitment, can be broken down into the following kind of components. All of them have some kind of expected outcome, either one that you specify or the regulation or the standard is has put in there. In order to achieve the outcome, you need to achieve certain objectives in order to produce and advance the outcomes that you're looking for. Okay, so objectives are the components, let's say, that produce the outcomes. And how you do that is usually specified in terms of some set of criteria, in terms of the level of performance or the level of quality or the level of rigor. And these tend to be agreed to, things that your agreement is part of the agreement, it's part of the standard, whatever that case may be. And this relates to the objectives and how the objectives should be met. And then those flow down into rules, prescriptions, procedures, perhaps standard operating procedures, and so on. So that's kind of the stack in terms of, you can think about in terms of an obligation, and that cycle in the middle is trying to improve the performance component of this. So we can certainly think of a scorecard that we can then use to assess how well we're doing against our objectives, and we can create a ranking or some kind of indicator that we can improve upon. So that's kind of the picture here. And of course, outcome-based obligations are at the top. That's what they're concerned about, the outcomes. Performance-based ones, well, they're concerned about the criteria, the specifications for the level of a performance of the objectives. Prescriptive based, well, they're all about the rules. So they're at the bottom there. And where does management based? They're talking about all the processes that you need to do to manage all of this. And so one of the things regulators look at is if you don't have a management system, then they don't have a lot of confidence that you can manage your obligations. It's clear, and then that's why they look for processes to validate, verify, to manage risk, to ensure objectives, to satisfy and sustain certain levels of quality and criteria, and they're looking at continual improvement. So there you go. That's kind of how it all fits together. And flowing out of that, we can then put together a set of measures. Okay, these are measures of performance, measures of conformance, measures of effectiveness, and measures of integrity, dealing with the culture that we need to have in order to effectively and more comprehensively meet all our obligations. So we covered a lot there, but just in terms of reviewing this part, what does compliance design tell us about an obligation and how it should be managed? Well, it tells us a number of things. It tells us about the level of compliance rigor. It tells us about the leadership and management support that's needed. It tells us about the controls that we may need to have. It tells us about accountability. Are we accountable for the outcomes? If we're doing prescriptive, no. But if we're doing outcome-based regulations, then we are. Or industry self-regulation, we are, and so on. So it tells us that kind of information. It tells us the level of investment we may need to make and what's at stake. What are we trying? What are the objectives? What are we trying to achieve? And the level of risk. That's really important. Okay, so we're going to go through the next parts briefly, but they're important. Section 4.6 deals with risk. This is the due diligence portion of an obligation. If you're not assessing and evaluating risk, you are not doing your due diligence. So we need a process for this. We need to understand the impact this has on our organization. We need to understand things like causes and consequences that related to non-compliance. If we don't meet this obligation, what are the costs? What are the consequences? And so on. So this is really important. There's something else that we need to understand. There's more information related to the particular compliance risk. We need to know what the level of risk is. Obviously, that needs to be there, but we need to understand the level of compliance risk the organization is willing to accept. What's the acceptable risk? What's the risk threshold? Without that, you won't know what controls to put in place or how much you need to do in order to deal with uncertainty. You need to have that information. What's the acceptable risk and how much risk am I taking on? And that's really important. So, you know, this is the definition that this standard is used. It also uses 19,000. The 31,000 standard also has used this definition. This is pretty much the de facto standard across the world now when it comes to risk. It's the effects of uncertainty on compliance objectives. That's why it's so important to know what your objectives are for your obligations. If you don't have them stated, then how do we know what the risk is? We don't. And a bow tie analysis can help you visualize and do a qualitative assessment of controls and how to think about it in terms of dealing with these risks, both the positive one, the negative ones, threats, as well as the positive ones, which are opportunities. And the last thing that we're going to look at is, before we kind of pull this all together, is the maintenance aspects of a compliance obligation. We need to manage the changes to the requirements and commitments, the changes to their impacts, and the changes to the organizational ability to meet your obligations. And that's really important. And we need a process to do this, as well as understanding the information. And this is a process that you may use. And some of you, if you're in high risk industries, will recognize this process as the management of change process. That's required and specified by almost all regulators in oil and gas, the chemical industry, and so on, process industry. They all require this, but it is a good practice for all companies to have with regards to managing change with respect to obligations. Okay, so here we are. Let's sum it up. Let's pull it all together. And let's see if we've answered Carl's question. What do we need to know? Well, we need to know certain parts about the obligation. We need to know its source, its category, the topic, the area of concern that it's trying to address, the particular regulatory or compliance design that's used. We need to understand what the requirement or commitment that we're making to it. We need to understand things like outcomes, objectives, what criteria do we need to satisfy, and are there any dependencies that we need to be looking at. So that's a very comprehensive list that deals with the obligation itself. And we certainly need to know these things. We also need to understand the impact that these obligations, these commitments and requirements has on our business. So we need to know the impact on product, services, activities, systems, processes, on the organizational structure. Are we organized to actually meet our obligations? And the way we govern, is our culture appropriate? Or do we have the right culture to do this? And how does it impact our stakeholders? Okay, so those are impact questions that we need to understand. We need to understand that part of it. Well, what else do we need to know? Well, we need to know the risk, compliance risk. We need to know what the risk is. We need to know what the threshold, what the acceptable level of risk is. How much risk is the organization willing to take on? And that could be different for different parts of this, right? So environmental could be different than safety, than for quality and financial and so on. You're going to have causes, effects, likelihood, severity, and a number of other quantitative and qualitative aspects to specifying or describing the risk. It's something that we need to know. Okay, we also need to understand the change. Changes are inevitable. They're going to happen. The obligations themselves are going to change. The impacts may change, the risk may change, and the organization may change. The ability to meet the obligations with an organization may change in such a way that threatens or exposes vulnerabilities in a company's ability to meet their obligations. So it's important that you address this, and we need to understand some pieces of information. So we need to know this. We need to understand how well we're doing. So we need some kind of measures. We have to monitor something. We need to know some measures of conformance. Yes, those are the basic ones. We need to know measures of performance, right? We need to know those too. And we need to know measures of effectiveness. Like, are we actually, are we just doing the work, but we're not getting the benefits? Are we actually being effective at meeting obligations? That's important too. So, and measures of integrity, in terms of our culture and the values and the way we're communicating and respecting people and the environment and so on. How well are we doing those? So these measures are important and they need to be specified as well. And then, of course, we have to make sure, we have to ensure that we meet these obligations, and we do that primarily through controls. And there's different kinds. There's administrative controls, risk controls, some that are preventive, some that are mitigative, some that are dealing with detection, and so on. And we put these in place so that we can be sure with a high degree of confidence that we can meet our obligations not only today, but tomorrow and every other day that we're going to be operating the business. Okay, very quickly, we've gone through a lot, but we're going to go back to Carl. And we've said, Carl, this is what we need to know. And the question that we have for you right now, we're going to do a poll, Jonathan's going to do a poll on this, is if you were Carl, would this information, the information we just talked about in that chart, would it help you better manage your environmental obligations?
So I just launched the poll, and please go ahead and answer. I guess the question seems fairly clear. I know Ray has provided a lot of information today. It's a lot to digest in an hour. So we will be sending out the recording and the slides after the presentation or tomorrow. And I do recommend that if you're not familiar with the guideline, that you take a look at our previous webinar. I put a link to the webinar we did on ISO 19600 in the chat of GoToWebinar, so you can click on that and have a look when you have a moment. But of course, you have to get a lot of context to understand all these things. It took me a while personally to understand this, so it's a bit abstract, but once you get it nailed down, it's great. So please answer the poll. We've got about 72% of people have voted, which is awesome. And I'm going to close this poll in just a moment. Want to give everybody a couple more seconds to answer, and then I'll share the results, of course. Okay, great. We're at 75% voted. Let's close this poll. I'm going to share the results. So this is awesome. This is great. It seems that the information Ray has presented would theoretically help Carl much better manage his compliance obligations. And then everybody said better. A couple of people said unsure, I'm confused, which is fair enough. It is
fair enough.
a lot of information to absorb. As I mentioned, take a look at the other webinar we did, and feel free to reach out to Ray or to myself to have a more one-on-one conversation and hopefully explain some of these concepts. But this is great. I think a lot of this information is very actionable and very important for organizations. So I'm going to hide this poll, and Ray, back to you.
Okay, yeah, those are good. So Carl's happy. He says, yes, this information is going to help us. And so this is a rhetorical question for you. And would it help you better manage your obligations? And we're thinking that you'll probably answer in the same way. And so that makes sense for us to now look at, well, what steps can you take to know your obligations better? And just to help us out and to maybe help yourself out in terms of kind of clarifying your thoughts, we thought, well, I'll ask number one, which attributes or sets of attributes, we're going to remind you what those are, the impacts, the obligations, the risk, the change, the measures and the controls, which sets of attributes tend to be missing from your obligation register? So back to you, Jonathan, on the poll.
Yep. Let me launch this poll. So which key attributes are missing from your compliance obligations register, from your obligations register? I'm seeing some responses come here, and people are saying obligations are missing from their obligations register. So we've seen at Mnemonic, we've seen so many different registers over the years. Some have been extraordinarily complex with just Excel files with sheets and sheets and sheets and all sorts of things, all interlinked. And they are often built by external consultants, and no criticism to them, but the challenge with those is often the maintenance. And Ray has written about the need to align your compliance program with your internal resources, because sometimes we get these ambitious ideas and then we try to implement them, and then we don't have the resources to manage them. But I think it's really critical that a register has all of these elements, and if you're missing some of them, it really, 1 + 1 = 3 in this kind of situation. So it's important to build something that's maintainable, but at the same time, you have to build something that's really actionable and useful to your organization. All right, most folks have voted. Let's give them all another 20, 30 seconds to vote, and then I'll close the poll. And organizers and panelists don't vote, it says, so we're not voting. We're not skewing the results. All right, I'm going to close this poll and share the results. So it's a fairly even distribution, but a lot of people don't have the measures and controls, interestingly, which I would argue is one of the most important elements, because if you've identified your obligations, but then you don't know how you're managing them, that's a huge hole. And that's where a lot of the business value is in terms of investment in this type of work. The business value is making sure you have systems and procedures and policies and everything in place to control and measure your obligations. So there you go. Those are the results. It seems like we all have a lot of work to do, but this is very helpful, Ray. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, so just in terms of helping you work through an improvement plan. So we've identified a particular category of attributes that tend to be missing. So what we would suggest is answering the question, what 3 attributes, or 1 or 2, doesn't matter, but focus on the most important ones, would help you significantly improve your ability to manage your obligations and to meet them. And that's something for you to take away and to think about with the way that you answered it previously. And then what steps could you take to start including those attributes in your obligations register? We attend webinars, we get some good information, hopefully you had some today, but we need to put this into practice, and we need to kind of continuously improve. And so maybe we can add 1 or 2 additional attributes to your register. Maybe you could do that. Maybe that would make a big difference to helping things downstream in terms of what things need to be audited, what needs to be assessed, what needs to be monitored, and what controls need to be put in place. So think about that. And lastly, and we're going to do a poll on this one, if you've created these steps, if you put these steps in place, would you be doing that in the upcoming weeks or in the near future? Let's leave it there, in the near future. Will you be acting on these steps?
And I think it's with any of these webinars, whether it's on compliance or something else, it's critical to take action fairly quickly after you learn about something, because we're all bombarded with so many requests and issues and challenges at our organizations that you want to strike while the iron is hot, as they say. So I think hopefully taking this and perhaps some of the other material that we have on the website and putting together a plan that you can implement over the next few weeks and into the holiday season, I think is critical. And then building up the business case within your organization, depending where you sit and how things are laid out. But will you take action on these potential improvements in your compliance obligation register in the next few weeks? I'm going to give just a few more seconds. Most folks have voted, so thank you. And don't be afraid to say no, because I see so far we have everybody saying no, but I also want everybody to give a realistic answer. So let me close the poll in 30 seconds. All right, and that wasn't 30 seconds, but we'll close it anyways and share it. So it looks like the vast majority of people are committed to improving their compliance obligations register in the near future, and that's great news. I'm very happy to see that Ray has provided action items for you. For the maybes, if we can help you on your journey, if you have remaining questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Mnemonic or to Ray, and we'll help you along this way and show you that it can be done and it's not that painful. All right, let me hide this. So Ray, I think that's all of our polls. Do you have any closing remarks before I wrap things up a bit?
Yeah, so those are, I'm glad to see people committing to or intending to put some of this into practice. and to improve their legal registers or obligations register in a way that's going to help them meet all their obligations. And that's good for to hear. And as Jonathan already mentioned, if you need any help with any of that, the folks at Mnemonic and myself can certainly be there to help you and help you be successful in doing this. So just to wrap a few things up, this is we talked about a small part of ISO 19600. We talked about what we need to know to better manage our obligations. So we've kind of looked at obligations in perhaps more detail. In some ways, and maybe some we didn't go in deep enough, and certainly that's certainly the case. But that would be something that we need to do. But the main point is the same. The better you know your obligations, the better you can evaluate the risk, and the better you can do something about it before risk becomes a reality, before risk can become a reality. As Jonathan has said many times in other presentations, I think, surprise me now or surprise me later. So we'd be better be surprised now when the cost of doing something about it is a lot less than paying for it later when we're when it's irreparable. Often we're not able to repair the damage. Many companies, too many that should be there, are only one incident, one violation, one data breach away from not only losing their business, their regulatory license, but their social license to operate. So we want to move people away from that edge, to be more proactive and more anticipate problems before they occur. So with that, I think we're going to open it up for Q&A and to handle that through the chat session and see if we can respond to your more specific questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Ray. So just one concluding comment here, and then we'll get to the Q&A. We are launching a 10-question scorecard to help you benchmark your compliance maturity. So this will be sent out by email, and please feel free to use this. Use the results from the scorecard internally, and we've designed this. A lot of what we discussed today is embedded in that scorecard, and we'll send out that email after the webinar. And please feel free to share it with your colleagues. So big thank you to Ray and to everybody who attended today. Feel free to reach out to Mnemonic at the email address below or by phone. We're based in Montreal, Canada, but we have operations in China and people spread around the world and partners in Europe. And I think let's go to the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the question panel here. I know we're getting near the 1.5 hour mark, and some people have had to run to other meetings or things. But one question I see here is, will we share the poll results, saying that the poll results are helpful to contextualize where different companies are with respect to obligations and compliance? And yes, this is coming from Sanjay. So we will share the poll results, we'll compile them, we'll probably put them up on the blog post that will have the video and the slides and a bit of information. We can put the poll results up there as well. Another question from Sanjay is, are there templates for obligations registers that are available from Ray or Mnemonic on the web, starting out with development of their obligations register? So yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the slide that Ray showed earlier with the different vertical columns in terms of control measures and sources and categories, in a sense, is a template that we use at Mnemonic, and then we build out the content within your compliance obligations based on your operations, based on the scope that you're looking to achieve. So we're definitely using a structure. I'm not sure I would call it exactly a template, but a structured approach to building out compliance obligations. And I think that's critical. Nobody wants to reinvent the wheel. And so using this structured approach that Ray's discussed today, as well as some other tools, is very critical. And yeah, a couple of questions about the slides and the videos, so we'll send those over. And then a question here from Stephen asking, how do we monitor obligations in 45 countries? That's a good question. The short answer is we've built a lot of software over the years to help us monitor government websites, track regulations, emerging regulations, put them into the system. And we do have a limited scope. We're not covering every single obligation that every single country has. That is perhaps a long-term goal. We're focused mostly on environment, safety, and quality at this point. And on our website, we have a list of all the topics or categories, as Ray called them, that you can see. You can see the scope. But basically, a lot of software, and then some humans as well, regulatory analysts with some very detailed procedures on how to track emerging obligations in Germany versus Italy versus the US versus China. So each country is, of course, somewhat different. But basically, a combination of software and people is the real trick. And there's some pretty nifty stuff. We have a lot of AI, artificial intelligence, natural language programming in the background that our customers don't see, but that we leverage to identify obligations within government documents. And happy to give you a one-on-one demo, Stephen, if you're interested. Just send us an email or give us a call. Any other questions from anybody on the call today? I see some people are having to run to other meetings, but certainly if anything comes up or if you have any questions about compliance, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll make everything available. And there's lots of other great webinars from Ray and from Mnemonic on the website. So without further ado, big thank you to Ray, big thanks to everybody who attended today. And I hope that everybody will take some action on their compliance obligations in the weeks to come. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Take care.